Good afternoon and welcome to Think Corner. My name is Adam Pratchett.
And my name is Kelly Brito. And it's a pleasure for us to welcome you all to the laureate lectures of the 38th World Cultural Council Award Ceremony hosted by the University of Helsinki.
Today's event will provide an opportunity for you to hear about the work of our two World Cultural Council Award winners. And we're really excited to have Professor Christoph Gerber and Professor Larry Hedges here with us today. But now, to officially open the event, please welcome Vice Rector of the University of Helsinki, Hanna Snellman.
Dear guests, it is my great honor to welcome you to the World Cultural Council's Laureate Lectures event. We are celebrating science and education here at the University of Helsinki's modern Think Corner. Opened in 2017 at the heart of Helsinki, Think Corner is our university's living room of science, an open arena for discussion and co-working, and a forum for science and research. We at the University of Helsinki believe that knowledge and learning are for everyone. The spark for learning and advanced education stems from curiosity. However, the inspiration to discover and develop something new is more than momentary insights. The university's strength lies in the continuous progress of scientific thought and research skills. The solid link between research and teaching guarantees high quality of learning. In solving global challenges with the help of science and research, we are looking into years and decades into the future. As Vice Rector, my work is founded on an ethos of collaboration. Multidisciplinary and international collaboration are indeed needed to create a sustainable and viable future for the globe. We also need to get inspiration from those who have persistently worked for science and education for decades. Today, we have a unique opportunity to hear the laureate lectures from two prestigious scholars. For almost 40 years, the World Cultural Council has recognized individuals who have made exceptional achievements in science, education, and the arts. The Council seeks to encourage the use of science, art, and education to further the well-being of humanity. Today, we will hear lectures from the winner of the Albert Einstein World Award of Science 2023, Professor Christoph Gerber. Gerber, yes, I pronounced it right. And the winner of the Jose Vasconcelos World Award of Education 2023, Professor Larry V. Hedges. The annual Albert Einstein World Award of Science recognizes individuals whose scientific or technological achievements have brought progress and benefit to mankind. The prize is awarded in recognition of the fundamental nature and broad impact on Professor Gerber's research on nanoscale science. The Jose Vasconcelos World Award of Education is granted to a renowned educator, an authority in the field of teaching, or someone who has brought about visionary development in education policy. The prize is awarded in recognition of Professor Hedges' groundbreaking and systematic application of research in his development of methods for meta-analysis over the past 4 decades, which have contributed to more accurate assessment of evidence across disciplines. The lectures are introduced in more detail by Katri-Anne Lehtipalo and Katariina Mertanen. They are among the 8 people from the University of Helsinki who were awarded special acknowledgement grants by the World Cultural Council this year. The grants were awarded to scholars who have achieved outstanding performance in the fields of science and education. Dear guests, knowledge and learning benefit us all. With the power of research-based knowledge, we will contribute to building a sustainable society and solving key challenges concerning our future. Next, we will have an insight to what World Cultural Council is all about. I wish us all an inspiring afternoon. Thank you.
Now it is my honor to invite Professor Sir Fraser Studdart, President of the World Cultural Council, to deliver his speech.
Honourable Vice Rector of the University of Helsinki, Hanna Selman, World Cultural Council 2023 laureates and eminent pioneers, Christoph Gerber and Larry Hedges, ladies and gentlemen. A claim is often made that science is global. At least it tries to be global. And it's also often said science knows no boundaries. But that depends on how you define boundaries. So let's have a reality check. The Earth's population statistics put in perspective. The population is around 7.8 billion people. And for most people, it is a very large number. If, however, you condense 7.8 billion into 100 persons, and then into percentage statistics, the resulting analysis is relatively much easier for us all to comprehend. Out of 100, 11 live in Europe, 5 in North America, 9 live in South America, 15 in Africa, and 60 live in Asia. Out of 100, 49 live in the countryside, and 51 live in cities. 75 have mobile phones, and 25 do not have mobile phones. 30 have internet access. 70 do not have the availability to go online. Out of 100, only 7 receive a university education. 93, in American parlance, do not attend college. 83 can read. 17 are illiterate. Again, out of 100, 33 are Christians, 22 are Muslims, 14 are Hindus, 7 are Buddhists, 12 have other religions, and 12 have no religious beliefs at all. Out of 100, 26 live less than 14 years. 66 die between 15 and 64 years of age, and 8 are over 65 years old. If you have your own home, eat full meals and drink clean water, have a mobile phone, can surf the internet, have gone to college, you are in a privileged less than 7% category. Amongst 100 persons in the world, only 8 live to or exceed the age of 65. You are over, if you are over 65 years old, be content and grateful. Cherish life and grasp the moment. If you've not left the world before 64, like the 92 persons who have gone before you, you're already the blessed amongst humankind. Take good care of your health and cherish every remaining moment. Where do these statistics leave science? I'm not sure. If you have to put a label on me, which I'm reluctant to take, but I will just have to say I'm a chemist. Now, if the atoms are the letters, the molecules are the words, the supermolecules are the phrases, the assemblies of supermolecules are the sentences, the hierarchical assemblies of supermolecules are the paragraphs. What about the chapters? What about the books? Chemistry, I want to convince you, is not what I was told when I started out my academic career, that it was old. It's a very young science. And I've mapped it onto the human timescale. Then it leaves us with someone who is a toddler, about 3 years of age. So there's a lot of steam left in chemistry. Anyway, we nonetheless have to admit, I think, that we live in an echo chamber. We work in a bubble, and we live in a village. Scientists often struggle against the odds to have their inventions and discoveries recognized, slowing down the good they do for the human race in the fullness of time. Take, for example, the discoverer of fellow Scot, Sir Alexander Fleming, of penicillin. It is a case in point. He has reflected, and here I want to illustrate the power of serendipity. One sometimes finds what one is not looking for. When I woke up just after dawn on September 28, 1928, I certainly did not plan to revolutionize medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic or bacteria killer. But I suppose that's what I did. Serendipity. As much as anything else, has a transformative role to play in science. Now, returning to the Fleming story, it took another 15 years before a team of Oxford biochemists, including Ernst Chen and Howard Florey, to elucidate the structure of penicillin in 1940, and another 4 years before it was saving the lives of Allied troops during World War II. The US and UK governments threw their wholehearted support behind large-scale production of penicillin. It was the beginning of the age of antibiotics, and it was life-changing. 2/3 of us would not be sitting in this great hall today, in this think corner today, if it had not been for the advent of antibiotics. I fear, however, that the level of support that the development of antibiotics received from politicians and governments of the 1940s, at least in the Western world, has not continued to the present day. It is already well established that the refusal of politicians in the US and UK alone to take advice from scientists at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic led to hundreds of thousands of people dying, unnecessarily so. Yet very few people batted an eyelid when politicians discredit science and ridicule scientists. That's where we have reached today. For the time being, at least, scientists are going to have to further their science for the good of humankind behind the backs of politicians and appeal and reach out to people by teaming up with the private sector. A good example of where this teaming up between the private sector and scientists and engineers is in the realm of climate disruption. Much of the science is ready to meet the challenge, yet most of the politicians and governments, particularly those in the larger countries, are dragging their feet, I'm sorry to say, but that's the way it is. That's my story. Let me conclude by saying it gives me immense pleasure to put on record my congratulations to the 2 World Cultural Council laureates, Christoph Gerber and Larry Hedges. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce the winner of the Albert Einstein World Award of Science 2023, Professor Christoph Gerber. He is professor at the Department of Physics at University of Basel, Switzerland. He was a founding member of the National Center of Competence in Research, Nanoscale Science, which led to the start of the Swiss Nano Institute, where he served as co-director for 14 years. Professor Gerber is pioneer in scanning probe microscopy with major contributions to the invention of the scanning tunneling microscope and the atomic force microscope. These techniques have enabled breakthroughs in the physical sciences, including material physics, chemistry, material science, and beyond. He was on the team who developed the lensless scanning tunneling microscope and has continued to develop these technologies further, adding numerous new innovations. The high flexibility of the atomic force microscopy to image, probe, and manipulate materials with unique resolution and the ability to be combined with other technologies has made it a powerful and versatile tool in nanoscience and nanotechnology of today. high-speed atomic force microscopy has for the first time enabled to visualize biological functions in real time. Professor Gerber and his team pioneered in the development of biochemical sensors, which has opened new doors for medical application and has contributed significantly to the rapid progress of life sciences and has made a great and positive impact on the health and welfare of humankind. So please, we are very eager and excited to hear your laureate lecture. Please, Professor Gerber.
Thank you so much for these kind words. It is indeed a great honor speaking to you today. When I received the phone call from Lilia Hernandez that I am the recipient of this prestigious award, we were just about to step up to the first tee of a nearby golf course. And you can imagine that it took a few fairways to digest the enormity of that call. So I have chosen the title of my talk, How the Doors to the Nano World Were Opened, from an article we published in the first issue of Nature Nanotechnology. The journal Nature contacted me whether I would write up the story of scanning probe microscopy. So for this new launch at that time. So I will cover some of the history and recent development. Okay? At the beginning of the 80s, the structures in semiconducting industry closing in to a few hundred nanometers. So that was the motivation to actually start the developing a new kind of microscope to visualize the nanometer. So tunneling is a quantum mechanical effect where current flows between two metals separated by a thin oxide layer or vacuum when a voltage is applied. If you now make a very, very, very sharp tip, preferably with just a single atom at the end, and the current might flow just through that single atom, and when the tip is part of a scanning mechanism with a feedback loop that keeps the current constant, and you can three-dimensionally image a surface on the atomic scale. My two colleagues, Gerd Binnig and the late Heini Rohrer, had this actually totally crazy idea of the scanning tunneling microscope, and they were asking me to help. Because nobody actually believed it is possible to place the tip in an angstrom's distance without bumping into the surface and killing the experiment. So we had to overcome to isolate all the vibration and ended up with a superconductive levitation. The microscopes was basically floating and a magnetic field that enabled us to measure the exponential behavior of the tunnel current. This means that if one changes the distance of the tip by 1 atomic diameter, the current changes a factor of 1,000. And giving the microscope this enormous resolution. So for this audience who maybe are not so familiar, 1 angstrom equals 0.1 nanometer equals 10 to the minus 10 meter in writing, like this. So it's very small. So we then proudly submit this result to the PRL, a leading physical journal, just to find out that the peers thought otherwise. So the first referee at that time said the exponential distance dependence on that tunneling current is well accepted, so the experiment does not give anything new and the submitted paper should be rejected. And the second referee said, okay, maybe this is a technical tool, but he leaves it up to the editor whether something like this should be published in PRL, Physical Review Letters. So the editor then said no, and we then published it in the Applied Physics Letter in that year. So it only started to convince people when we published this atom-by-atom relief of the 7x7 reconstruction. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to go into that. But anyhow, it was the first time it was possible to get up close and personal with individual atoms on surfaces in a three-dimensional representation. And we even got an image processing award for this, and I mean, that was quite a story. Anyhow, so image processing for SBM gained from the simultaneous dramatic pace in the computer industry. Again, this is an image of the atomic landscape of a 7x7 reconstruction in the 111 direction in silicon. However, it was still very difficult for the young community to verify our results. Therefore, we organized this workshop high up in the Austrian Alps. And Gene Golovchenko, he just broke the ice, verifying the 7x7 for the first time outside our lab. And from that moment on, I can tell you, the mood of the attendees on that conference turned absolutely euphoric. And the Alps were buzzing and vibrating with the crazy new ideas applying such microscopes in many different areas of science. Many of these participants here, like for example, Carl Quaid from Stanford, Nico Garcia, from Spain, Mark Welland from Britain, also knighted by the Queen. Hans Günther, for example, in Basel, to set up that place there. And John Pethica, also knighted by the Queen, mentioned in his talk that when you are so close to a surface, then atomic forces must act on the tip and in between tip and sample. And this basically triggered the idea of the atomic force microscope. And the sole reason why we've done it is to get atomic resolution on non-conductive surfaces. That was a drawback with STM, who just can actually image conductive surfaces. So this, we changed everything here, and this is a very compact, was my first sketch here of the AFM at that time. And we completely changed the setup. It's very, very compact, has a high mechanical eigenfrequency of about 50 to 60 kilohertz to isolate the complete vibration from outside. So the heart of the microscope is a micrometer thick cantilever with an integrated tip measuring, controlling the atomic forces acting between tip and surface with a laser. By keeping the forces constant with a feedback system and scanning X and Y basically allows imaging any surface on the atomic scale. This is the first AFM, where the first cantilever was a microscopic gold foil, and the first tip was a fragment of a diamond from a turntable glued to the cantilever. Material costs did not exceed $100. So you see, for a proof of principle, not necessarily you have to build a Ferrari. And the analogy to it also, I always think that is the first transistor, who maybe people have recognized this here. So, but this is it lives in the Science Museum in London in an exhibition called "The Making of the Modern World," and I think the kids love it. And the Apollo 10 moon capsule in the background is in very good company. So it's this actually, and it is this a conglomerate of atomic forces acting between tip and surface that inspired people around the world and triggered a whole plethora of new ideas. The high flexibility, as has just been mentioned before, to image, probe, and manipulate materials with unprecedented resolution and to be combined with other technologies made it the most powerful and versatile toolkit that the nanoscience that we have today. So the semiconductor industry, what I mentioned before, is now down from 300 nanometers at that time just to 3 nanometers structure-wise in the new iPhone 15 Pro Max Titan. And the AFM is ideal instrument to identify local defects and vacancy and contamination on the scale. So there are still 6,000 to 7,000 annual AFM publication. And from a commercial point of view, a forecast that the turnover will go up to about $800 million towards the end of this decade. And the nanotechnology industry will grow up to 300 billion turnover. And then when you Google atomic force microscopy like that, you get in between 50 and 70 million hits. I guess many of today's influencers would be proud of this. So this shows the advantage of the AFM. It can image both conductive, as I said before, surfaces and insulators like this salt crystal island on atomic scale. But you also can use it as a sculpture. You can sculpting atom by atom just with a chisel and prepare an island or whatever on an atomic scale, like following the contours of Switzerland. Here is a single atomic sheet of graphene nanoribbon. It's tracked over a gold surface with the AFM tip allowing to study a state known superlubricity, where all the friction is vanishing, paving the way to frictionless coating. Nano devices will certainly benefit from this insight. This is work in Ernst Mayer's group at our institute. Patrick Malentinsky's group is using an amended AFM called scanning single spin magnetometry based on diamond nitrogen vacancy centers to image magnetization, localization defects, and magnetic domain of atomically thin crystal magnets, and has the potential of being developed into a new kind of biosensing device. This is a dried up red blood cell from a very famous person. They are preserved in a tissue sample for more than 5,000 years in the Iceman, from the Austrian-Italian Alps. The morphological and molecular composition of this blood is verified by atomic force microscopy and Raman spectroscopy measurements. The cell size and shape approximated those healthy, dried, recent blood cells. So IFM for a long time was considered to be slow for imaging biology in real time. It took Toshio Ando's group at the University of Kanazawa, Japan, 14 years to develop high-speed AFM to enter the domain of chemical activity, monitoring the cellular machinery at the nanoscale and the millisecond resolution. This is a high-speed AFM image of a living cultured hippocampal neuron. The white square indicates the AFM imaging area of a dendrite in action in real time, basically showing that in the brain neurons only are activated when in need. This lowers the power consumption of the 100 billion neurons considerably. Rewriting the genetic future with CRISPR, where Cas9 protein can be guided along the genome to cut out malfunctioning genes and be replaced by a new donor, eradicating genetic diseases like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis. This again is a high-speed AFM image that shows the protein Cas9 placed on the DNA strand that it is cut. Emmanuel Charpentier, one of the discoverers of CRISPR, says that they are awaiting FDA and European approval to treat the first patient with sickle cell disease next year. Life within the cell. nuclear pore complex, part of nuclear envelope, is a selective barrier, controls transport and molecules between the cytosol and the nucleus. And in a recent combined breakthrough study from the last year with cryo-EM and AlphaFold, an AI program, the structure of the NPCs is basically solved. AlphaFold can accurately predict 3D models of protein structures down to the atomic scale, and is now accelerating research in nearly every field of the biology. However, equally important is the functionality of these pores, of these pore complexes. 3 models have been put forward regarding the function, and high-speed AFM favors strongly the polymer brush model. And this is work from Rod Lim from our institute. So those are the pore complex in total action, and you can see that with high-speed AFM. Adidas is one of several startups from the SNI. It rapidly diagnoses cancer in patients' biopsies based on a nanomechanical biomarker, detects its aggressiveness, and predicts the probability of a patient developing metastasis by investigating the elasticity between benign and malignant biopsies. This is also by Rod Lim. During mitosis, adherent cells undergo a drastic shape of change from essential flat to round, and this cell rounding process can be tracked with a cantilever by measuring the pressure induced by the cell. And here we see the cell division transparent underneath the cantilever. This is work from Daniel Müller at the ETA Institute and also the SNI in Basel. So we teamed up. We've taken this step a bit further with Daniel Müller's team and introduced a cell balance based on optical excited nanoresonator that measures the total mass of single or multiple adherent cells in culture conditions over days with millisecond time resolution and picogram mass sensitive. And Nature has taken this EM image of adherent HeLa cell up in their best image library. What a sight, don't you think? So our main interest in recent years was the development of an ultra-rapid, highly sensitive nanomechanical biosensor array with these cantilevers for early diagnostic, making precision medicine available from personalized therapies. So there are 2 operational modes to biochemically functionalize these arrays. That includes reference sensors, preventing unspecific binding, temperature drifts, etc. So we have the static mode and the dynamic mode. One gives the conformational changes and one the mass and mass changes, and we can do that also simultaneously. So the transduction is converting biochemical processes into nanomechanical motion. Differential measurements, instant calibration, response time in milliseconds. So single-stranded oligonucleotides with a short alkane linker are self-assembling, forming a single monolayer, and upon hybridization, the complements are squeezing in and lead to a surface stress, bending the sensor, showing highly specific single-point mutation accuracy and sensitivity. So here are 3 studies concerning diseases that pose serious threat to human health. Skin cancer is still one of the predominant cancer worldwide, and melanoma is its worst scenario. We have teamed up with Donato Rimoldi and Katrin Klatz. In this double-blind study, we show the identification of BRAF genes with single-point mutation sensitivity using total RNA obtained from biopsies of metastatic melanoma from patients with no false positive or negative. Processing time from biopsy to diagnosis is below 1 day and does not require PCR amplification, sequencing, or labeling. The world has just witnessed a terrible virus pandemic, as we just heard, rising antimicrobial resistant epidemic that may leave us defenseless against a wide range of bacterial infections, with already 1 million annual deaths is already threatening humanity. So we teamed up with Adrian Eglev from the University Hospital, and he built up one of the biggest multi-drug bacteria database in Europe to investigate mutations in the relevant genes associated with antibiotic resistance, which is the frequent cause for multi-drug resistance. So the antibiotic vancomycin was for a long time the last resort, but is against MDR, but is fading and is replaced by linezolid. This is the identification of the specific response of the 2 relevant mutations, leading to a concentration dependence that shows unprecedented sensitivity of 10 femtogram per microliter in total RNA, with a measurement range of 8 orders of magnitude. And in the vancomycin-resistant genes, we can detect 10 bacteria with extremely high specificity, a fast response time of 5 minutes, and this indeed is very important to start a new therapy. Sepsis is one of the most underestimated disease worldwide, with about 50 million annual cases and 10 million sepsis-related deaths. The process here is to extract the total RNA from patients' whole blood, circumventing the time-consuming bacterial culturing that takes up to 72 hours. And we show the detection of the 2 highly relevant bacterial species, E. coli and Staphylococcus aureus, with only 2 colony-forming units CFU sensitivity. And the detection limit of 20 infection bacteria in E. coli and 30 bacteria aureus in the whole blood of patients without cultivation. This, we believe, could indeed lead to a game changer in very early diagnostic, because no other commercial device exists who can do this. So it's bringing together the top-down approach with the bottom-up of self-assembly and self-organization that is so wonderfully established in the natural world. When we started this journey, we never envisioned enter the clinic with this technology, basically from the bench to the bedside. And we, in recent years, we have the impact of AFM into biology. We have written this up in a series of review articles. There was an AFM on Mars with the Phoenix mission to investigate Martian soil on the nanoscale. There was also one AFM with European Rosetta mission to comet Chury, 850 million kilometers away from Earth, to study stardust on the nanoscale. Do we have to go out there and do that today? Not necessarily, says Jose Angel Martin Gago. And he and his team built the most complex machine called Stardust to investigate cosmic dust in an artificial process. And the cosmic dust eventually occurs in the aftermath of a supernova. To the surprise of the astronomers, the team only finds alkanes, chemical compounds of saturated hydrocarbon forming linear chain molecules, and as shown here in a sub-nanometer resolution with non-contact AFM. And here, in a reference sample from the meteorite Allende that fell on the planet in 1963, showing the same results, only alkanes, and none of the aromatic hydrocarbon molecules. 2/3 of known molecules have an aromatic structure with components of DNA and proteins, the building blocks of life. So it remains to be seen whether life was imported from space. Leo Cross and Gerhard Meyer developed an AFM method just to interact with the chemical forces, monitoring the discrimination between these bonds. So the correlation of the bond order between the central ring and the outer ring, the length difference is just 0.003 nanometer. That is how good this gets. So not even the sky is the limit for AFM. Not even the sky is the limit for AFM, it seems. And it seems it's still thriving for New Horizon. It's the right size of our sun, the right place in the habitable zone of our galaxy, the right constellation of our planet and the moon, that after 4 billion years, a species emerged starting to ponder about the universe and the wonder of our world, with Albert Einstein as its primus inter pares. So I hope I could give you a very brief introduction how the doors to the nano world were opened and state-of-the-art research developments, the way it is impacting many different disciplines, leading to new technology for the benefit of mankind. I was very privileged, I still am, to work with many brilliant minds, and I am enormously grateful for this. So we just look at that, and then I just have one more slide. Okay. This is the late John Bardeen, the only physicist winning the Nobel Prize twice for physics. He was a very keen golfer, and allegedly was working at the University of Urbana-Champaign just because the campus was surrounded with golf courses. So he once apparently said that he is equally proud of his hole-in-one in golf as with his 2 Nobel Prizes. A hole-in-one in golf is still on my agenda. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Gerbert. So thank you again, Professor Gerbert. If you're happy to, we have time to take a couple of questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and my colleague at the back will hand you a microphone. Okay. I think you've given us a fantastic introduction to your work. So let's thank once again Professor Christoph Gerber. So now we'll have a short break to enjoy some coffee and tea served behind you at Fönster. So please be back here at 2:45 as we'll continue with the laureate lectures. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed that break. If I could ask everyone to please return to their seats, we'll be starting the program again in just a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. First of all, I would like to warmly thank the World Cultural Council for giving me the opportunity to present our next speaker. My name is Dr. Katariina Mertanen, and my own academic home is here in the University of Helsinki, in the Faculty of Educational Sciences. I have to say that it is a privilege and an honor to present to you our next speaker, Professor Larry V. Hedges from the Northwestern University, United States of America. He is the member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow in multiple prestigious organizations such as the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. He's also a winner of highly regarded Yeadon Prize for Education Research. Professor Hedges is a prolific researcher and writer. His body of work consisting of, to be honest, would be way too many books and articles to count, expands over 4 decades, exploring questions of sociology, psychology, educational policy, and statistics. Most importantly, Professor Hedges' work has had and continues to have a significant impact to the way in which we are all looking at the role of evidence in education. That rigorous and tireless pursuit for evidence in educational research is what impresses me the most as an early career researcher. Most of all, I greatly admire the commitment to Professor Hedges' development of meta-analysis and the new ways to synthesize the vast amounts of accumulating research on important topics very close to my heart and in my own work, such as the role of gender and race in education, to mention a few. Although Professor Hedges' work focuses on development of statistical tools for meta-analysis, it would be very unfair to say that his work is only, or his tools are only mathematical amusements or intellectual pastime. At the core of his work is to find ways to explore our understanding about educational practices and policies in a way that no single study could ever achieve. Meta-analysis for Professor Hedges is a way to truly make an impact in this world. We all know that one research paper brings only a tiny drop to the vast amounts of accumulating body of knowledge. Also, we know that in the everyday practices of the classroom or in the policy making, it's impossible to find time to follow up on the cutting-edge research that is done across the globe nowadays. There is a gap between knowledge and praxis. Professor Hedges' work is filling this gap. Through analysing and combining the findings of multiple existing studies, enables to provide insight to what is actually evident and what we all as educators should implement in our own work. By providing ever-developing tools for other researchers, his legacy has been established, and it has been established a long time ago. Through this legacy, Professor Hedges' work impacts not only research community, but also everyday lives of students, teachers, and parents worldwide. By providing evidence for educators, policymakers, researchers, and everyone passionate about education, his work has indeed changed lives. Through the examination of the best evidence-based practices in education and teaching, Professor Hedges' work provides new opportunities, especially for those in marginalized and disadvantaged positions. Next, you will hear him tell you about the topic he is truly passionate about, the power of evidence in building and improving humanity as a whole. Please give applause and warm welcome to the award winner of World Cultural Council's Jose Vasconcelos World Award of Education, Professor Larry V. Hedges.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here, but I should confess as I begin that my primary professorial appointment and much of my work for the last 40 years has been in statistics, and it might be reasonable to ask why a statistician is here talking about education. I hope I can make that a little clearer in the talk that I'm going to give today, which is going to focus on the topic of meta-analysis and the synthesis of evidence for both scientific and policy purposes. I've always had an interest in using research to improve education. Statistics is used in the kinds of studies conducted in fields like education, the social sciences, for example, psychology, and also in other fields like medicine. These fields tend to do comparative studies about whether a new approach, I'm going to call that a typical new approach a treatment. These fields do comparative studies to see whether a new treatment, a new approach, is superior to existing ones. For example, is one way to teach reading superior to another, or is one medical treatment superior to another? Now, long before I came on the scene, mathematical statistics developed pretty comprehensive ways of designing and then analyzing these kinds of comparative studies. And some exposure to those methods is part of the training of nearly all researchers in education, the social sciences, or medicine. I'm going to refer to those three kinds of fields collectively as sciences and the practitioners of them as scientists. This is just a shorthand. I don't mean to disrespect or slight any other sciences. I just need a term for those fields, and I think that's the appropriate term for empirical work in those areas. Now, most of the training on design and analysis of experiments in these fields focuses almost exclusively on single studies in isolation. And by that I mean the technical methods address how to design and analyze the results of a study as if it provided the only relevant evidence about the question at hand. There are methods that don't make that assumption, but those are really not used very often these days in the fields that I'm talking about, or in fact in many fields. So I think it's fair to say that the perspective that I've outlined, that most scientists have the most training in dealing with statistical analysis of single studies in isolation. It has been true, and it still is true in most of those fields. Now, that's not an unreasonable thing, because training focusing on the analysis of single studies actually is very much part of the scientists' lives in these fields. The unit of production of science for most of these scientists is the single study, and the unit of interpretation is the single study. So it's entirely logical that the statistical training people get is about that very problem. And in fact, I can assure you that as a statistician, most of the inquiries I get from other scientists are about how to deal with issues in a single study they're conducting at the time. Now, this description of science may sound a little reductionistic. You may be thinking, well, wait a minute, science is supposed to be a cumulative enterprise. Don't these scientists you're talking about think about that too? Well, of course they do. They plan and assess their work in terms of what's come before, but each study is a relatively independent entity. And it's precisely when these scientists are called upon to understand more than one study at a time that their intuition and technical training has often failed them. Now, the reason why that's important is because almost any important scientific or policy question is investigated more than once in multiple studies. This is why we have scientific journals that publish reviews, and why textbooks distill reviews and studies into syntheses to try to essentially express the accumulated evidence. In the late 1970s, when I was a graduate student, I think most scientists in education, most researchers in education, felt confident in their ability to review and synthesize studies in their field and to describe what the accumulated evidence was. And the same was true of researchers in related social sciences and in medicine. But it turns out that the problem of interpreting multiple studies, ensembles of evidence, is more complex than most scientists believed. Scientists were just beginning to understand this when I was a graduate student. And that happened in 1976. I started graduate school in 1976, studying both statistics and education. America had a large education research establishment at the time, but there was a great deal of disillusionment with the work that had been done. And here I can quote the great historian of American education, Carl Kazel, who wrote at the time that education research had a terrible, I guess he used the word awful reputation, both among academic disciplines and the public. At that time, the quantitative and experimental paradigms that had animated previous decades of research seemed to have failed. The studies didn't seem to replicate well, nor did the work that was being done accumulate well into some greater body of knowledge that seemed to have leverage on the problems we were facing. Influential scientists, influential education researchers, seriously proposed that discovering systematic knowledge in education might be impossible. As an example, Lee Cronbach, who was a giant in both education and psychology, actually suggested that the problems of education might be so complex that it was like entering a hall of mirrors in which reflections upon reflections would endlessly confuse us. But other scholars at the time were wondering if knowledge didn't accumulate because we needed better methods of accumulating knowledge. One of these scholars was a man named Gene Glass, who was an educational psychologist, and he argued that what we needed were methods that would take the results of statistical analyses from multiple studies and provide a method to draw general conclusions from them. He called this kind of analysis of analyses meta-analysis. When I began my career and actually began my work on meta-analysis, most American statisticians thought the idea of meta-analysis was not promising. In fact, some of them derisively called this voodoo statistics. And as a young scholar, that was a little bit disappointing because it was the thing I was interested in. But I persisted, and I'll say a little bit more about meta-analysis, but before saying more about it, it's probably worth asking the question, why do you need some special kind of analysis to interpret ensembles of studies? And after all, scientists are in the business of doing these studies. They design and carry them out. Surely that gives them all the tools they need to interpret groups of studies, right? Well, actually, the surprising answer is no. And I can say this emphatically because this is a lesson that's been learned not only in the fields that I've described, but in other sciences, beginning in the early 1800s in astronomy and continuing through the 20th century in education, psychology, and medicine. And it seems as if, as a sort of comment on this history, that each time a field has developed a large enough volume of research evidence, they confront the problem of methods for synthesizing that work, and they've gone on to develop their own specialized methods for doing that. And different fields have developed somewhat different methods, but the similarities and differences are kind of interesting, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the particularities of education and related fields like psychology and medicine. And in those fields, one of the major reasons why meta-analysis, a specialized discipline of accumulating, synthesizing evidence is necessary, is that it's necessary to avoid what I call inference traps. Inference traps are perfectly reasonable ways of thinking that nonetheless lead to incorrect interpretations. I want to illustrate two inference traps and discuss their implications, and I need to find the little device that will advance the slides. I think they'll advance the slides. I mentioned already what meta-analysis is, but I'd like to now talk about a particular example and use that to illustrate what I call inference traps. So this slide summarizes the findings from 33 experimental studies in medicine. And I want to use medicine for the example for a particular reason. This slide summarizes the findings of 33 studies that were conducted between 1959 and 1988, about a 29-year history of experimentation. Each of these studies listed here was a pretty good clinical trial. There was a randomized controlled trial published in a medical journal, and they all dealt with the same treatment for the same life-threatening condition. And as you can see from this list, that most of these studies found that the treatment was not effective. You'll notice that some of the studies listed are in red, and those are the ones that found a statistically significant, that is, conclusive effect, positive effect of the treatment. So so you won't have to count. I can tell you that 27 of the 33 studies found that the treatment was ineffective. 6 of them, a little less than 20%, found that the treatment was effective. Now, there doesn't seem to be much pattern to the results of these studies. You'll see that in the 1960s and 70s, 13 of the studies found that the treatment was ineffective and 3 found it was effective. In the 1980s, it was the same thing. 13 studies found that the treatment was ineffective and 3 found it to be effective. Between each of the studies that found the treatment was a success, there's a string of failures. So this doesn't seem immediately promising as a therapeutic intervention. They stopped doing studies of this treatment in 1988. And you might think it was because they finally discovered that this was a loser of a treatment and they ought to stop trying, experimenting with it. And you might not blame them, because who could argue that a treatment worked when 80% of the time, more than 80% of the time when you study it, it proves ineffective. What makes this an interesting example for me is that what happened in 1988 was that this treatment became the standard of care for the condition for which it was used, and it became unethical to randomize people not to receive the treatment. The condition the treatment's used for is acute myocardial infarction, heart attacks, and the treatment is so-called thrombolytic therapy, the use of a drug to dissolve blood clots in the blood that are the cause of the heart attack. Newer versions of this treatment are still the standard of care today. But why, after this dismal research record, did this become the standard of care in medicine in the US and later worldwide? Well, 2 things seem to have influenced that decision. One was a very large study, the one that's listed as ISIS-2 up there. It's one of the 6 that found the treatment effective. And another thing was a meta-analysis of the studies that had been done up to that time, up to 1988. Now, the point of this example is that if you look at the conclusions of these studies, which are the yeses and nos listed in this little table, you'd see that they're pretty consistent. Very few of the studies show that the treatment worked. And I'm going to argue that that is, in fact, the wrong conclusion to draw from these studies. And the reason it's the wrong conclusion is that the meta-analytic approach would do something a little different. The meta-analytic approach would seek to combine the data, not the conclusions of the studies. And that is what distinguishes meta-analysis from other approaches to synthesis. This slide illustrates the data from the 33 studies. Now, at the top, you see there's a label that says odds ratios. And you can think of essentially the odds ratio as representing the relative risk of dying if you receive the therapy versus if you don't. You'll see that there's a vertical line at the relative risk of 1, and that is the point at which the treatment is neither helpful nor harmful. Everything to the left of 1 represents a situation in which the treatment is found to be helpful, and you can see that each study is represented by one of the rows in this picture, and the dot on each line represents the study's estimated relative risk, and the line that goes on either side of the dot represents the range of uncertainty for that particular finding. So essentially, all of the relative risks that are depicted by the line going on either side of a dot are the range of relative risks that are consistent with the data found in the study. And you'll see that almost all of the studies have quite a large range of relative risks that are associated or at least are consistent with the results of that particular study. So if we look at the very first study, you can see that there's a dot at about 0.18, and the very first one at the top. And that represents an 18% relative risk, which is a very favorable relative risk found in that particular study. In other words, it's an 82% reduction in relative risk compared to not receiving the treatment. But you'll see that the range of uncertainty for that first study also includes some numbers on the other side of 1, so it's also consistent with relative risks that are actually larger, that the treatment might be, it's consistent with the idea, with the possibility that the treatment might be harmful. Now, once the data has been represented in a way like this, it's possible to do a statistical summary of the data. And at first glance, it might not be obvious that a summary is going to tell you very much because the dots are all over the place. They don't look terribly consistent unless you remember that these lines associated with each study represent the range of relative risks that are consistent with the findings of that study. So any two studies whose lines overlap are actually finding relative risks that are consistent with one another. Now, this picture doesn't give you much insight about the summary that you might want to draw if you had to say one thing about what do all of these studies mean. But you might sort of squint and look at the dots and say, well, it looks like the typical relative risk is about 0.75 or 0.8, so that represents a 20 to 25% reduction in risk as a sort of typical value. It maybe is not so obvious from that picture, but I can tell you that, in fact, a statistical analysis of this data will tell you that the typical sort of the estimated relative risk from all of them is about a 25% reduction. Now, not every study found a 25% relative reduction. Some found more, some found less, some even found that the treatment increased risk. But as a typical summary of all of the studies, a 25% relative risk is a pretty good one. And of course, what this picture illustrates is that each one of the studies has a great deal of uncertainty. Now, the meaning of all of this becomes a little clearer in the next slide, which shows a summary of those studies. In fact, it shows not one summary, but 33 summaries in what is now called a cumulative meta-analysis. And the way this works is that the very first line at the top is the result, represents the result of the first study. The second line from the top represents a combination of the evidence from the first study and the second study. The third line from the top represents a combination, a summary of the first 3 studies, and so on. And in this way, you can see that indeed the combined relative risk from all of these studies is to the left of 1, so this treatment does seem to be helpful. And I should say that this picture, it depicts results in the same way as the last one. The dot at the center of the line represents the single estimate from the combined evidence, and the line going to either side of the dot represents the uncertainty in the combined evidence, or the range of relative risks that are consistent with the combined evidence. I wanted to show this cumulative meta-analysis plot for an important reason, and that is if you look to the plot, and I'm going to see if I can use the pointer. Oh, I can, okay. If we look to 1973, one of the things you can observe is that in 1973, the combined estimate from the first 8 studies has reached statistical significance. That is, the range of uncertainty associated with the combined estimate is all on the side of being protective, being favorable to those getting the treatment. And it essentially stays statistically significant throughout all of the other studies as they're later combined. Now, this is important because it shows that as early as 1973, we could have known that this treatment was effective in reducing deaths from first heart attacks. In other words, after 8 studies, 15 years, after 8 studies in 1973, 15 years before it became the standard of care. Now, I selected this example because the condition being treated is very serious. There are 500,000 deaths from first heart attacks in the United States alone every year, 500,000. And if we imagine a 25% reduction in risk, which this treatment was capable of producing, that means that the treatment could have saved 125,000 lives every year. And over 15 years, it could have saved over 1.5 million lives. Now, meta-analysis was new to medicine in 1988. It wasn't available in 1973, so this is not a case that it could have been used, but it wasn't. In fact, the technique wasn't available. And it wasn't, I should say that even in 1988, the meta-analysis wasn't the only factor that led to the adoption of the therapy as the standard of care. But it has since become the standard method for synthesizing results in medicine and psychology, as well as education and other social sciences. Now, I said that this example illustrated inference traps. One of them is what's been called vote counting. And the logic of vote counting seems kind of unassailable. I'll sort of have a graphic that illustrates it. The idea is that metaphorically each study casts a vote for or against the treatment, in favor of it or not. And the treatment it wins, it's declared effective if it gets a large enough proportion of the votes. You might say that thrombolytic therapy got only 20%, actually less than 20% of the votes, so it would lose any sensible vote count. Now, this vote counting logic was quite common when I began my work on meta-analysis, and there's good reason for it. It's simple and it's compelling. You know, how can you possibly claim that a treatment works if most of the studies find that it doesn't? Well, you know, that's a tough argument to beat. So to kind of understand this better, some of my original work, early work in my career, looked at the properties of vote counting strategies as statistical inference procedures, as if they were formal statistical procedures. And one of the things that came out of that work was that even if a treatment is consistently effective, vote counting often tends to the incorrect conclusion that it is not. And another terrible property of vote counting is that and quite counterintuitive actually, is that it actually has the property of producing worse decisions in some cases when there is more evidence available to it, more studies. This is, whether it's intuitive or not, this is a terrible property for a decision procedure to have. The study also illustrates a second kind of inference trap. When one study, Smith's study, say, finds a statistically significant effect, but a second study, say Jones's study, doesn't, it's commonplace among researchers, and you know, I say this advisedly. I've heard people say it. I may have even said it myself in an incoherent moment. We say that, well, Smith found an effect, but Jones failed to replicate. The journalists and ordinary people think this way too, not just scientists when they're not thinking quite the right way. We hear about a study that finds some treatment significantly reduces risk, and a second study finds it doesn't, and so we conclude that the studies must disagree. But that's not true. The example of thrombolytic therapy actually is an illustration of that. We saw that 80% of the studies, more than 80% of the studies, reached the same conclusion, but in fact, the conclusion they reached was not the right conclusion. Not only that, these studies actually were statistically all behaving as if they were estimating the same underlying treatment effect. And so the notion that 20% of these studies disagreed with the other 80% didn't mean that those studies, in fact, disagreed with the other studies. They were actually quite consistent within their own uncertainties. Now, the detailed procedures of meta-analysis and its use in systematic reviews of research entails specialized knowledge and training. It's become a professional specialty of its own that kind of overlaps many of the disciplines that I discussed as areas where it's applied. But it's developed its own set of journals, its own professional organizations, and actually employment opportunities. And there's even a new institutional form that's emerged, which I call the Evidence Clearinghouse, that supports specialized work in accumulating evidence. There are over 30 such evidence clearinghouses in the world today, and they focus on a variety of things, topics like education, employment policy, youth policy, and medicine, among others. So this kind of work has made a big impact on the way in which evidence is used for policy purposes and for scientific purposes within the disciplines that I described. Now, I've described my work on meta-analysis in terms of medicine and trying to tell a dramatic story of lives lost when we could have known how to save them. The research was already done. We just needed to interpret it properly to save those 1.5 million lives by the therapy for heart attacks. But the same story could be told about educational progress that's lost when we could have known how to better educate our children. You know, schooling is, after all, 10,000 hours of compulsory treatment. We require it by law in many countries. We owe it to our children to be sure that the treatments that we subject them to are as effective as possible. And education is too important not to use the best scientific methods available in our work to improve it. Thank you, and I'll conclude there. Whoops, I guess I'm going the wrong way. Nope, I went too far. I thought I had a thank you slide, but I don't know where it is. So I won't thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hedges. Very thought-provoking presentation. And we have a few minutes to take a few questions here on site, or my colleague can help you with the microphone.
My name is Stig Nordling from the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Medicine. How do you handle the problem of publication bias? Because it's quite possible that those negative results will never be published. So it might be more than 80% negative, whereas it's likely that all positive ones will be.
Well, that's a problem. That's a fundamental problem in doing meta-analytic work. I may point out that it's not a problem of meta-analysis. It's a problem of scientific research, and that it doesn't go away if you don't use statistical methods to combine the evidence. If you never see a negative result, then you can never discover what the truth might be about the efficacy of a treatment. And so this is, of course, a major problem, and one of the things that I and others have done is to first try to understand what the magnitude of this problem could be. You know, understand the size of the biases it could introduce, and it's possible to do that theoretically. But then the question is, well, are those worst-case scenarios realized in practice? And so there are a variety of ways of providing at least suggestive information about how serious publication bias might be in any particular body of evidence that you happen to be looking at. Now, I say suggestive because you can never know about the things that are not available to see. It's the missing data in statistics is a fundamental sort of problem that is addressed, that is inevitably addressed with the caveat, of course, you can never know the right answer to the data, to this question about missing data unless you, in fact, know the missing data, which you don't. But the best we can do is try to, in the short run, understand what indications there may be that there might be missing data. The best answer is to make sure there isn't any. And the way you do that is by changing scientific practice. And I think one of the major accomplishments in the medical research community about 20 years ago, not quite 20 years ago now, was an agreement among the Council of Medical Journal editors to publish a joint editorial in all their journals saying that from a certain date onward, a clinical trial that was not pre-registered would not be, a report of a clinical trial that was not pre-registered would not be published in their journals. And this doesn't solve the problem entirely, but if every study was pre-registered, we'd know which studies were conducted that we didn't see in the literature, and that immensely reduces the problem of dealing with publication bias. And other fields have followed. I'm proud to say that, and I had something to do with this, that in education we have established a registry of trials that are purported to yield causal evidence, and we have worked very hard to get granting agencies to encourage, granting agencies and journals to encourage the practice of registration, because that is probably, prevention is probably the best answer to how you solve the publication bias problem. You know, all the other answers, you know, pale in comparison with that one. So I'm working very hard, and others are working very hard to, on the prevention issue.
Any other questions from the audience? I guess not. Thank you so much, Professor Hedges. I think he deserves another round of applause. And this concludes our event for today. Thank you so much for joining. And for those of you who followed us online, thank you so much for joining as well. And we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the University of Helsinki main building for the official award ceremony. Have a nice afternoon.